In 2008, a federal courtroom in Ocala, Florida, fell silent as Wesley Snipes, the action star who had dominated Hollywood throughout the 90s, stood before Judge William Terrell Hodges. What happened next would shock everyone present. The judge, with decades of experience on the bench, allowed himself a small chuckle at what seemed like yet another celebrity trying to outsmart the system. Little did he know, Snipes was about to demonstrate a level of legal acumen that would stun not just the court, but legal experts across the nation. Comment where you're watching from today. The federal courthouse in Ocala wasn't accustomed to Hollywood glamour. Its stark corridors and wood-paneled courtrooms had seen thousands of cases, but never one with this much star power. Outside, media vans lined the streets as reporters jostled for position, all hoping to capture the downfall of one of cinema's most recognizable faces. Wesley Snipes, the man who had brought Blade to life and starred in blockbusters like Demolition Man and White Men Can't Jump, now faced serious tax evasion charges that could send him to prison for up to 16 years. Judge Hodges had presided over countless tax cases throughout his distinguished career. At 73, the Reagan appointee had heard every possible excuse from defendants trying to explain why they hadn't paid their taxes. To him, Snipes initially appeared to be just another wealthy individual who thought the rules didn't apply to him. The prosecution painted a simple picture: a celebrity who had willfully failed to file tax returns for several years, depriving the government of millions in tax revenue. What made this case particularly interesting was Snipes' demeanor in the courtroom. Unlike most defendants who appeared nervous or resigned, Snipes carried himself with remarkable composure. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, he sat beside his legal team, attentive and focused. There was no hint of the action hero persona that had made him famous. Instead, he projected the image of a studious, thoughtful individual who had prepared meticulously for this moment. The prosecutor approached the bench with confidence, outlining the government's case. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Mr. Snipes deliberately chose not to file tax returns from 1999 through 2004, despite earning over $38 million during that period. This wasn't an oversight or a mistake. It was a calculated decision to defraud the United States government." As the prosecutor continued detailing the charges, Judge Hodges occasionally glanced at Snipes, trying to gauge his reaction. The actor remained stoic, taking notes and whispering to his attorneys. What struck observers was how engaged Snipes was in his own defense, not as a passive participant, but as someone who clearly understood the legal intricacies of his case. When it came time for the defense to respond, Snipes' lead attorney began by acknowledging the seriousness of the charges, but suggesting that the case was far more complex than the prosecution had indicated. "Your Honor, what we have here is not a case of willful evasion, but a profound misunderstanding of Mr. Snipes' tax situation and the advice he received from financial advisors." It was at this moment that Judge Hodges allowed himself that fateful chuckle, a small, almost imperceptible sound that nevertheless conveyed his skepticism. The bad advice from advisors' defense was one he'd heard countless times before. The gallery noticed the judge's reaction, and a ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Snipes noticed it too, but rather than appearing offended, a look of calm determination settled across his features. What happened next would change the entire trajectory of the trial. When Snipes requested to address the court personally, against the typical advice given to defendants, eyebrows raised throughout the courtroom. Judge Hodges, though surprised, granted permission, perhaps curious about what the actor might say in his own defense. Snipes rose from his seat with the same fluid grace he'd displayed in his action films, but there was nothing performative about his demeanor. He approached the podium, arranged his notes methodically, and began to speak. His voice, powerful yet measured, commanded attention without seeming theatrical. "Your Honor, I stand before you today not to deny my responsibility as a citizen, but to clarify the nature of the decisions I made, based on information that I believed at the time to be legally sound." The courtroom fell completely silent as Snipes began articulating a sophisticated understanding of tax law that few had expected from an actor. He referenced specific statutes, court precedents, and the contextual framework of his financial decisions. It quickly became apparent that Snipes hadn't merely memorized talking points prepared by his attorneys. He had immersed himself in the legal complexities of his case. Judge Hodges' expression transformed from mild amusement to genuine interest. The seasoned jurist leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he processed the unexpected legal discourse being presented by the defendant himself. Court reporters would later describe this as the moment the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably. What made Snipes' presentation particularly compelling wasn't just his knowledge, but his approach. Rather than presenting excuses or deflecting blame, he methodically addressed each element of the prosecution's case, contextualizing his actions within the framework of the advice he'd received and the complex interpretations of tax law that had informed his decisions. As Snipes continued, legal observers in the courtroom exchanged glances of surprise. The judge, who had initially seemed prepared to view Snipes as just another celebrity trying to evade responsibility, was now listening with rapt attention. The prosecutor, sensing the shifting dynamics, began making notes rapidly, preparing to counter arguments that were far more substantive than anticipated. By the time Snipes concluded his initial address to the court, the dynamic in the room had transformed. The dismissive chuckle from earlier had been replaced by an atmosphere of serious legal consideration. The case that many had expected to be a straightforward conviction of a Hollywood star was revealing itself to be something far more nuanced and complex. What no one in the courtroom fully appreciated at that moment was that they were witnessing just the opening moves in what would become a legal chess match of unexpected sophistication, one that would challenge assumptions about celebrity, tax law, and the very nature of justice in America's courtrooms. The morning of the trial had begun with the kind of Florida sunshine that seemed to mock the gravity of the proceedings inside. As Wesley Snipes made his way through the gauntlet of cameras and reporters, there was none of the swagger that had defined characters like Blade or Simon Phoenix. Instead, observers noted a man who moved with purpose, his eyes focused ahead, ignoring the chaos of questions being hurled his way. This wasn't the first time Snipes had faced adversity, but it was perhaps the most consequential battle of his life. Inside courtroom 3A, the wood-paneled chamber held an atmosphere thick with anticipation. The gallery was filled to capacity, a mix of media, legal students, curious locals, and industry professionals who had come to witness what many believed would be the downfall of an action icon. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the proceedings, illuminating every expression, every gesture, every nuance of what was about to unfold. Judge William Terrell Hodges' reputation preceded him. A Nixon appointee elevated to the federal bench by Reagan, he had served for over 3 decades and was known for his no-nonsense approach to tax cases. His courtroom operated with military precision, and he had little patience for celebrity or status. His wire-rimmed glasses and stern demeanor gave him the appearance of a strict professor rather than a jurist, and few defendants left his courtroom feeling they had received leniency. The prosecution team, led by senior IRS attorney Robert O'Neill, had prepared meticulously. They had built what they believed was an airtight case. Wesley Snipes had earned approximately $40 million between 1999 and 2004 and had filed no tax returns during that period. The evidence included banking records, contracts, and correspondence that they argued demonstrated a willful attempt to defraud the government. They had successfully prosecuted Snipes' tax advisors, Eddie Ray Kahn and Douglas Roseil, labeling them as tax protesters who had led Snipes down a path of criminal liability. What made this case particularly fascinating was that it wasn't simply about a celebrity who had failed to pay taxes. It centered on Snipes' adoption of what the government considered tax protester arguments, complex, often misguided interpretations of tax law that claim certain citizens are exempt from income taxation. For the prosecution, this wasn't just financial negligence. It was a deliberate ideological stance against the authority of the IRS. Snipes' defense team, however, saw it differently. Led by veteran attorney Robert Bernhoft, they were prepared to argue that Snipes had been misled by financial advisors he trusted, and that his failure to file was the result of sincerely held, if incorrect, beliefs about his tax obligations. The nuance of this position, acknowledging mistake without admitting criminal intent, required a delicate legal balancing act. What few in the courtroom knew was the extent to which Snipes had educated himself about tax law during the years leading up to his trial. While most celebrities facing legal troubles relied entirely on their attorneys, Snipes had spent countless hours studying legal precedents, tax codes, and constitutional law. The action star, known for his physical discipline and martial arts expertise, had applied that same methodical focus to understanding the legal battlefield he now found himself on. The dynamics in the courtroom shifted subtly when Snipes' co-defendants were brought in. Eddie Ray Kahn, the founder of American Rights Litigators and the Guiding Light of God Ministries, had refused counsel and remained defiant. Douglas Rosile, a former accountant whose license had been revoked, appeared resigned to his fate. The contrast between these men and Snipes, in demeanor, preparation, and presence, was striking to everyone present. As the proceedings began, the prosecution laid out their case with methodical precision. They presented Snipes as a wealthy, privileged celebrity who believed he could operate above the law. They highlighted letters he had sent to the IRS, challenging their authority. Documents that, taken at face value, seemed to support the image of a tax protester rather than someone who had made an honest mistake. Judge Hodges listened attentively, occasionally making notes and asking clarifying questions that suggested he was inclined to view the case through the lens the prosecution had crafted. His initial interactions with the defense team carried a subtle but unmistakable skepticism, the kind that comes from years of hearing similar arguments from defendants trying to evade responsibility. What the prosecution hadn't anticipated, however, was the depth of Snipes' personal involvement in his defense. While most defendants in his position would have remained silent, allowing their attorneys to speak for them, Snipes had insisted on taking an active role. He had prepared detailed notes on every aspect of his case, participated in strategy sessions, and demonstrated a surprising command of complex legal concepts. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly tense as the morning progressed. The gravity of what Snipes faced, up to 16 years in federal prison, hung in the air. For a man who had built his career playing characters who triumphed against impossible odds, this was a real-life scenario where his freedom, reputation, and future hung in the balance. What would ultimately turn the tide, though none could have predicted it then, wasn't just the legal arguments that would be presented, but Snipes himself. Behind the action star persona that had made him famous, there existed a thoughtful, articulate individual with an unexpected aptitude for legal reasoning. The same intensity that had made him convincing as Blade had been channeled into understanding the intricate details of his case. As Judge Hodges peered over his glasses at Snipes, his initial dismissiveness was about to be challenged by what would become one of the most surprising legal performances by a defendant in his long career on the bench. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge preconceptions and ultimately reshape how everyone in that courtroom viewed not just Wesley Snipes, but the very nature of justice in high-profile cases. As the second day of the trial commenced, the atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed. Word had spread about Snipes' unexpected legal acumen, drawing even more spectators and media representatives. The prosecution, initially confident in what they believed was an open and shut case, now approached the podium with a newfound caution. They had spent the night reassessing their strategy, recognizing that they were facing a defendant far more formidable than they had anticipated. Prosecutor Robert O'Neill began the day with a more aggressive approach, perhaps sensing that the narrative was slipping from his control. "Mr. Snipes may speak eloquently about tax law, Your Honor, but actions speak louder than words, and his actions clearly demonstrate a pattern of willful evasion that no amount of legal rhetoric can disguise." Judge Hodges, who had appeared so dismissive on the first day, now watched with a measured expression. The slight smile that had played at the corners of his mouth, the one that had so briefly conveyed his skepticism, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, his focus was intense as he evaluated each argument with what observers described as renewed scrutiny. The turning point came when the prosecution introduced what they believed was their strongest evidence: a series of letters Snipes had sent to the IRS, challenging their authority to collect taxes from him. "These are not the actions of someone confused about their tax obligations," O'Neill argued, his voice rising slightly. "These are the deliberate actions of a tax protester who believes he is above the law." It was then that Snipes requested once again to address the court directly. This time, there was a palpable tension as Judge Hodges considered the request. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "The court will hear from Mr. Snipes." Snipes approached the podium with the same composed demeanor that had surprised the court the previous day. But now there was something else in his bearing, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. He had sensed the shift in dynamics and recognized the opportunity it presented. "Your Honor," Snipes began, his voice resonating through the courtroom, "the prosecution has presented these letters as evidence of criminal intent, but I would like to contextualize them within the framework of my understanding at that time." What followed was not the defensive posture of a celebrity trying to evade responsibility, but a methodical deconstruction of the prosecution's argument that left many in the courtroom stunned. Snipes didn't deny writing the letters. Instead, he walked the court through his thought process at the time, explaining how his interpretation of certain tax statutes, while ultimately incorrect, had been sincere. He referenced specific sections of the tax code, court precedents, and constitutional principles that had informed his understanding. Most importantly, he drew a clear distinction between questioning the application of tax law and refusing to comply with it once properly understood. "Your Honor, I was not refusing to pay taxes. I was seeking clarity on my obligations under the law. Clarity that, regrettably, I sought from advisors who provided me with incorrect information." The prosecutor attempted to interrupt, but Judge Hodges raised his hand. "I'd like to hear Mr. Snipes out," he said, his tone conveying a respect that had been absent the day before. As Snipes continued, legal experts in the gallery exchanged glances of surprise. What they were witnessing wasn't simply a well-coached defendant repeating talking points. This was someone demonstrating a genuine understanding of complex legal concepts and applying them to his specific circumstances. The prosecutor, when finally given the opportunity to respond, tried to redirect the focus to what he characterized as the simple facts of the case. Regardless of Mr. Snipes' eloquence, the fact remains that he failed to file tax returns for 6 years. This is not a matter of interpretation or misunderstanding. It's a clear violation of federal law. But the dynamic had shifted. Judge Hodges, who had initially seemed inclined to view the case through the lens the prosecution had crafted, now asked a series of penetrating questions that suggested he was considering alternative perspectives. "Mr. O'Neill, is it your position that any failure to file constitutes willful evasion, regardless of the defendant's understanding of their obligations?" The question cut to the heart of the case. For a conviction on the most serious charges, the prosecution needed to prove not just that Snipes had failed to file returns, but that he had done so with willful intent to defraud the government. The distinction between poor advice and criminal intent suddenly seemed less clear-cut than the prosecution had initially presented it. As the day progressed, Snipes' legal team built upon the foundation he had established. They introduced evidence that Snipes had, in fact, sought multiple professional opinions about his tax situation, demonstrating a good faith effort to understand his obligations. They presented witnesses who testified to Snipes' character and his history of seeking proper legal guidance in other aspects of his career. The most dramatic moment came when Snipes' attorney introduced into evidence a letter Snipes had written to the IRS years before the period in question, a letter requesting clarification on certain aspects of his tax situation that had gone unanswered. "Is this," the attorney asked rhetorically, "the action of someone seeking to evade taxes, or is it the action of someone seeking to comply with laws they did not fully understand?" By late afternoon, the energy in the courtroom had transformed completely. The prosecution, which had begun the day on the offensive, now found themselves responding to points raised by the defense rather than driving the narrative. Legal observers noted that Judge Hodges, who had initially treated Snipes with thinly veiled condescension, was now engaging with him as he might with a respected attorney. As the court adjourned for the day, the consensus among those watching was that something remarkable was unfolding. The case that many had expected to be a straightforward conviction of a Hollywood star had evolved into a nuanced examination of the distinction between mistake and criminality, between questioning the law and defying it. In the corridors outside, legal experts who had come expecting to witness a celebrity's downfall found themselves discussing complex points of tax law instead. And at the center of it all was Wesley Snipes, not just as a defendant, but as someone whose understanding of his own case had fundamentally altered its trajectory. The judge who had laughed was no longer laughing. Instead, he was listening, and that, in itself, represented a victory few had anticipated. The final day of Wesley Snipes' tax evasion trial dawned with an electric anticipation that seemed to vibrate through the courthouse corridors. Legal experts who had initially dismissed the case as a predictable celebrity takedown now filled the gallery, drawn by reports of Snipes' remarkable self-defense. National media, which had initially framed the story as another Hollywood star facing justice, had shifted their narrative to Blade star surprises court with legal prowess. Judge Hodges entered the courtroom with a demeanor noticeably different from his first appearance. Gone was the slight condescension, the subtle eye rolls, the dismissive chuckle that had so defined his initial reaction to Snipes' defense. In its place was a measured respect, the kind reserved for participants in a legitimate legal debate, rather than defendants destined for conviction. The prosecution's closing arguments reflected their strategic adjustment. Rather than portraying Snipes as a willful tax evader, they now emphasized that ignorance of the law, even if genuine, was no excuse for breaking it. Mr. Snipes may believe he was seeking clarification rather than evading responsibility, O'Neill argued, but the law does not distinguish between those who misunderstand their obligations and those who ignore them. It was a subtle but significant shift from their opening position, a tacit acknowledgement that Snipes had successfully challenged their characterization of his intent. Where they had initially portrayed him as deliberately defrauding the government, they now suggested that his error, while perhaps sincere, was still culpable. When it came time for the defense's closing, the courtroom fell into a hushed silence. To everyone's surprise, Snipes himself rose and approached the podium. His attorney began to object, clearly concerned about the risk of an unscripted final statement, but Snipes placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. After a brief, whispered exchange, the attorney nodded, though his expression betrayed his apprehension. Judge Hodges raised an eyebrow but did not object. "The court will hear from Mr. Snipes," he said, leaning forward slightly, as if to better catch every word. "Your Honor," Snipes began, his voice carrying the same power that had commanded movie screens for decades, but now tempered with a scholar's precision. "Throughout these proceedings, there has been a fundamental question at the heart of this case. What distinguishes a mistake from a crime? What separates misunderstanding from evasion?" For the next 30 minutes, Snipes delivered what many legal observers would later describe as one of the most eloquent closing arguments they had ever witnessed from a defendant. Drawing on precedents, statutes, and constitutional principles, he articulated a vision of justice that recognized the distinction between criminal intent and good faith error. "I stand before you not asking to be absolved of responsibility for my mistakes," he said, his voice unwavering. "I stand before you asking for the distinction between error and criminality to be recognized. The prosecution has demonstrated that I failed to file returns. What they have not demonstrated, because they cannot, is that I did so with criminal intent." The most powerful moment came when Snipes addressed the letters that had formed the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. "These letters have been presented as evidence of defiance," he said, holding up copies for the court to see. "I submit to you that they are, in fact, evidence of engagement, of a citizen attempting, however imperfectly, to understand his obligations under laws of extraordinary complexity." Judge Hodges, who had maintained his judicial stoicism throughout most of the trial, now watched Snipes with undisguised interest. The transformation was complete. From the dismissive chuckle of the first day to this focused attention, the judge's evolution mirrored the larger shift in how Snipes was perceived by the legal community. As Snipes concluded, the courtroom remained silent for several seconds, the impact of his words hanging in the air. The prosecution, given an opportunity for rebuttal, seemed almost reluctant to break the spell. When they did, their arguments felt perfunctory, a procedural necessity rather than a passionate conviction. When the jury retired to deliberate, legal commentators began their analysis. The consensus among them was that while Snipes had mounted an extraordinary defense, the legal threshold for acquittal on all charges remained high. Most predicted a split verdict, perhaps acquittal on the most serious charges of felony tax fraud, but conviction on the lesser misdemeanor charges of failing to file returns. The jury's deliberation lasted longer than anyone expected, nearly 3 full days. When they finally returned, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Snipes sat with perfect composure, his expression revealing nothing as the jury foreman rose to deliver the verdict. On the counts of felony, tax fraud, and conspiracy, we find the defendant, Wesley Trent Snipes, not guilty. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecution's case for willful evasion, the heart of their allegations against Snipes, had been rejected. On the counts of willful failure to file tax returns, we find the defendant guilty. The mixed verdict represented a significant victory for Snipes. While he had not escaped conviction entirely, he had successfully defended against the most serious charges, those that carried the potential for lengthy imprisonment and that alleged criminal intent, rather than mere negligence. When it came time for sentencing, Judge Hodges addressed Snipes directly. "Mr. Snipes, this court has been impressed by your articulate defense and your evident commitment to understanding the legal issues in your case. It is clear that you are not, as initially characterized, a standard tax protester or someone with contempt for the law." The judge's words confirmed what had become apparent throughout the trial, that Snipes had earned a measure of respect from the bench that few defendants ever achieve, particularly in tax cases where the federal judiciary tends to be unforgiving. Nevertheless, Hodges continued, the law required consequences for the misdemeanor convictions. Snipes was sentenced to 3 years in prison, the maximum for the misdemeanor charges, but far less than the potential 16 years he had faced when the trial began. As Snipes was led from the courtroom, legal experts gathered in the hallway were already analyzing the broader implications of the case. What had begun as a seemingly straightforward prosecution of a celebrity tax evader had evolved into something more significant, a nuanced examination of the line between mistake and criminality, between questioning the law and defying it. For Wesley Snipes, the action star who had surprised everyone with his legal acumen, the outcome represented both a personal vindication and a sobering reality. He had defeated the most serious charges through his unexpected legal brilliance, demonstrating to a dismissive judge and a skeptical legal establishment that there was far more to him than his Hollywood persona suggested. Yet he still faced consequences for his errors, a reminder that even the most eloquent defense cannot entirely erase the impact of past mistakes. As one legal commentator observed to a gathering of reporters outside the courthouse, what we witnessed in there wasn't just the trial of Wesley Snipes, it was a master class in how a defendant, through personal knowledge and commitment to their case, can fundamentally alter its trajectory. The judge who laughed at the beginning wasn't laughing at the end, he was listening, and in that transformation lies the most important lesson of this remarkable case.